Thank you, Juliet. Hello, everyone. I'm Deborah Short, TESOL's past president, and on behalf of the TESOL Board of Directors, I thank you for joining us for our first Indigenous Languages webinar. This particular one is titled Indigenous Languages, Teaching Practices, and Migration Data. We have a jam-packed hour for you. These webinars, you might gather, are an important component of our recently launched association-wide efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of TESOL. We had a task force, the Diverse Voices Task Force, that some of you may be familiar with, and their efforts led to a report and next steps that the TESOL board and staff are undertaking with the help of all our members. Juliet will post in the chat the direct URL for those who are interested. And if you just forget that, go to tsol.org and you can find more information about our DEI initiative. I'm going to begin and tell you a little bit about our panelists and then introduce each one in turn before they start their particular portion of the webinar. Today we have panelists from Chile, Canada, and the United States. They'll highlight how to take into account the local Indigenous worldview when teaching English, how to decolonize language and promote awareness of Indigenous cultural practices to help us avoid falling into deep-seated settler cultural stereotypes and colonial language use, and instead help us cultivate understanding and respect. They'll also talk about how to review and utilize migration data and maps of Indigenous languages in the US diaspora. So sit back for a really exciting session. We will have the panelists speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each. And we'll go in order with Elizabeth, Diana, and Blake. And then we will have a moderated question and answer period. Please post your questions in the chat to everyone or to me, Deborah Short, directly throughout the presentations. I will collect the questions and pose them to our panelists at the end. I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves during the presentations. Thank you for that. So let me begin and introduce our first panelist. Elizabeth Torrico Avila is with the Universidad de Atacama in Chile. Dr. Torrico Avila attained her PhD degree at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. She holds a master's in linguistics from the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, although I typically say in England. And she has a master's in translation studies from the University of Birmingham, also in the UK. She's interested in language policy and language and power in the Latin American context. She's currently researching the promotion of English in Chile, the struggle to revitalize Kunza language, an indigenous language in northern Chile, and the commodification of language in a neoliberal context. Her talk for us today is titled, A Proposal to Teach English from the Local Indigenous Communities Epistemology. So with that, let me welcome Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah, for the presentation. I am very glad for this invitation, and especially because it's been English teachers have been trying to explore new ways to teach English in our context, especially because we have indigenous groups here, and the national curriculum is favoring the teaching of English. So it's been a process since the 2000s and the 1990s to get to this stage today in which English and indigenous communities can dialogue and see that they both can be in the classroom in a friendly and nice environment rather than the initial way in which it was in which it was taught. And this is what I would like to start, or how I would like to start my presentation today. I would like, first of all, to contextualize what's going on in the language policy in Chile, because originally in the 2003, Presidente Ricardo Lagos, with the help of his educational minister, Sergio Vitar, they introduced a language policy called Chile Bilingüe. Chile Bilingüe, in which they wanted to turn the country into a Spanish-English bilingual one. And the goal was to achieve economic development and to be part of the globalized world. We're talking about 2004 and 2003 here. And of course, for linguists, this policy, this language policy was nearly impossible, right? Because you cannot turn a country into a bilingual one within 3 or 8 years. And that was the starting point of my research on this field. Because I am not only an English teacher by training, right, by my undergrad education, but I am also a member of an indigenous community called Licanantay, or Atacameños, in the second region of Chile, San Pedro de Atacama, in that area. And so such an invasive, such an aggressive language policy introduced in a context in which you have a native language doesn't seem friendly, or it didn't seem to respect the rights, and not only the human rights, but also the linguistic rights of a community at that point. But the problem can be more complex than that, and this is what I would like to explain. What happens here is that in 2000 and no, in the 1990s, the Chilean government, before implementing this bilingual policy, Spanish-English bilingual policy, which makes the teaching, or which introduces the teaching of English in Chile in an aggressive way since the fifth grade of primary education in Chile until the graduation day through, and at the moment of graduation, the students have a certification, like they have a national exam, national evaluation, in which they need to prove that they have achieved a certain level of English, hopefully B1, B2, according to the European framework of the Common Reference European Framework.
Elizabeth,
But
I'm sorry to
that
break
side
in.
of the problem, yes,
Elizabeth, I'm sorry. We're not seeing
there
your
is an
camera.
internet connection.
Yeah, can you try turning it off and turning it back on and seeing if that makes a difference?
I turn it on. I think there is an internet problem. It's supposed to be on.
Okay, well, that's fine. We can hear you
but I think
fine.
it's
So
going to
if you can't get your camera to work, that's, oh, now we're seeing you. Sorry for that interruption.
Yeah, but I think it's because of the internet. No, but I think it's because of the internet, the problem we are having, right? So I'll go back. So there are two sides of the story I would like to tell you. On the one side, it's that because of the English language policy implemented in Chile, that at the end, or at the graduation moment, students are supposed to be certified because they have an evaluation which is called CIMSE de Inglés. It's a national evaluation to measure the level of English they reach graduation, at the moment of graduation. That is one side of the problem, but there is also another side. So first, I'm going to go with the first one. In the 1990s, the Chilean government, the Chilean Ministry of Education, starts to explore or work with the indigenous communities we have in Chile, which are today 10, and they are recognized, these 10 communities: Atacameños, Aymaras, Quechuas, Collas, Changos, Alacalufes, Yagán, Rapa Nui, Mapuzungun, or Mapuches, gente de la tierra. And the Ministry of Education worked with every single community to develop teaching materials, all of those focused on the meaningful elements of each communities, the elements that should be rescued to teach in the classrooms and divided by levels, right? Like, I don't know, not only primary and secondary, but also each year of education. And as I said before, it had to be relevant, meaningful, and used by the community in everyday lives. And that work was done with the 10 communities with the Ministry of Education, supported and hand by hand with the communities. But what happened in the 1996 is that the Ministry of Education only, or by 2000, because that was the beginning, and by 2000, the program called Programa Orígenes only implemented something that only implemented for languages, or the teaching of 4 languages in the national curriculum, which are only Mapuzungun, Quechua, Aymara, and Rapa Nui, or Pascuense. And this, of course, created some tensions with the other communities that work with the Ministry of Education, in the hope that their languages would also get a recognition from the Ministry of Education, from the government, and from the society. And why am I linking these national or in indigenous languages with the teaching of English? Because I told you that the problem has 2 sides, and the other side of it is that the language, the Ministry of the public
Isn't it better to turn off the video because then the connection may be better?
Yes, Artur, maybe all of us should close our videos and let Elizabeth try again, maybe even if she keeps her video off, it will help her too.
Yeah. I think that the thing is on her side. So if she turns off her video, the connection may be much better.
Thank you. I think she's dropped, so hopefully she'll come back.
Yes, she has dropped. Let's give her a minute to see if she comes back. All the joys of internet, right? I do not see her coming back in yet. Ah, there she is coming back. Just a minute. Elizabeth is rejoining us again. Elizabeth, are you back with us?
So I
There you
can I go on?
Yes, please go on.
Yes, Elizabeth,
Yeah,
why don't you keep your video off to help increase your bandwidth?
Yeah. So just to summarize, because I lost a few minutes, is to say that I was just explaining what happened with the indigenous languages, because of the languages were not, these languages were not promoted, not all of them, by the Ministry of Education, but on the other hand, the Ministry of Education was promoting English as a tool, not even as a tool for bringing economic development to the country, rather than focusing on the cultural and the lifestyle of the Anglo-Saxon communities, or trying to understand how communities lived, or their daily lifestyles, right? So with this sort of dichotomies, there are a few Chilean teachers that have been trying to build a bridge on how to bring together the two cultures, not only the Anglo-Saxon culture, but also the native languages communities together. And so we have 3 projects here that I would like to very briefly summarize. We have Ramos and Lucia Ramos y Michelle Riquelme, who worked in the north of Chile with the community, with an Aymara community, and the teachers were interviewed. And so what they said is that they were trying to teach elements of the Aymara culture, such as the New Year activities, or the way that the Aymara community lives. But even though those teachers were given some tools to do that, some of them were reluctant. They said that teaching English to these communities in a different way is a sort of discrimination. So for them, the curriculum to teach English should be the same for every single student. For some of them, that is the reply of some of them. We also have the work of Eliana Barrios. She worked in 2000 at the beginning of this Programa Orígenes, and she worked with the community in Chiloé. What she did was to explore the way that a community lived in a small village in Chiloé, and she translated, or she transformed that lifestyle, the elements of that community, into English activities. For instance, she had a picture of a community there, and she asked the students, I don't know, how many sheep can you see there? What is the name of the lake? What do they farm in the land? These sort of things. And this was the first approach of a more intercultural way of teaching English that she started to do in the 90s. What she did here was the first unit to teach English in this way. And the final activity that I could collect and I would like to share too with you, or final approach, it's proposed by Glass and Volkmann, CA de Valparaíso, and the Universidad de Valparaíso, Católica de Valparaíso, and Universidad de Concepción. And what they want to do is try to teach English in a more intercultural way, trying to understand or include all the indigenous groups of Latin America. And they want to explore how the way these groups work with their farming, with their economy, with their culture and their society. And they explore the discursive elements of these elements of their lifestyle, trying to get the meanings of the communities, the meanings that the community employs when they are carrying out these activities. And this is what they teach in English. So it's there is the common element of these three projects. It's the intercultural elements of these communities, the way these indigenous groups lives, the way they interact, they teach their children or their economies, and which is also close to what the Ministry of Education did at the beginning in the 2000s, only trying to get the meaningful elements of each community. But I think we can still rescue those the previous work done by these communities, and now try to find the way, the elements and the professionals and the resources to use English as a way to teach them, to turn these activities into English teaching activities, rather than having English, having or exploring the English as a political element. I don't know if I'm explaining myself clearly. What I am suggesting is to teach English, employing all these intercultural elements of all these South American and Latin American indigenous communities, rather than seeing English as a foreign element or as a tool for economic development, or as the oppressor or the colonizer. And I think that's how I would like to finish my presentation, because I'm afraid of the internet connection.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Sorry about the internet connection, but quite interesting. Certainly a part of the world that I don't have a lot of experience with, and maybe some of our listeners don't either. You've really explored some of the tensions in a bilingual environment where the country's overall language has been Spanish, and they're bringing in English for economic development, and perhaps only giving recognition to a few of the many indigenous languages that you have in Chile. So it was nice of you to lay out some strategies, ways that you could, I think, as you said, teach English with intercultural elements, so that the content of what they're studying or reading or writing about is related to the local cultures and the lifestyles. Thank you for sharing that with us. Next, we will hear from Diana Jeffries. She's with the Atira Women's Resource Society, Flow Society for Collective Learning and Wellbeing, British Columbia Teachers of Additional Languages. Diana works in the education and the community service sector in various capacities. Through art-based learning, storytelling, and trauma-informed approaches, she's committed to providing quality education and meaningful community engagement to support the needs and highlight the resilience of those that she serves. And these include immigrants, refugees, women, children, and youth. Diana has worked with a number of community and service providers throughout British Columbia and across Canada. She's written several resources on approaches to differentiated learning, trauma-informed teaching practices, health and well-being, and decolonization. She's presented at several conferences and universities across Canada, and her talk is titled Indigenous Peoples in Canada, Language History and Resilience. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you so much. Can you see this screen? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. It's really nice to be here this afternoon. I'm speaking to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am very grateful to have this opportunity to live and work on this land. So this presentation I'm giving today is based on a resource guide that I wrote on behalf of BC TEAL, BC Teachers of English as Additional Languages. And it came to me as an idea when I was a teacher years ago and teaching in the federal program called LINK, which is Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada, which is a federally funded program across Canada and teaches either in English or in French. And what I noticed in the program was that there was a real lack of decolonization and Indigenous knowledge that was being taught in the classroom, and how language itself is a real aspect of decolonization. So language we use reflects and propels societal change. In Canada, Indigenous people are at the forefront of that change. And so when I was looking at this resource, I was thinking, how is it that English language teachers in particular can discuss and engage students with the literary terms, with the best language usage in English to address decolonization strategies that Indigenous people in Canada are addressing, particularly right now more than ever. There have been some attempts made, in particular by either universities, by the federal or the provincial or municipal governments, to address some of these issues around language. So in this slide, you will see, for example, this is street signs at the University of British Columbia, which is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. And they have made attempts to address language around creating, for example, bilingual signs where you have in English and in Musqueam. The same with federal signs on highways where you have the Squamish Nation and the highway runs through their territory. So it is in a bilingual sign with Squamish and English and Squamish languages. And then also some decolonization strategies around names, and in particular, for example, the Haida Nation, which lives at Haida Gwaii, which was in history and how I was raised was always called the Queen Charlotte Islands, has now reverted back to their original name called Haida Gwaii. And also you can see, for example, we have two official languages in Canada, French and English, but we also, there has been attempts made, for example, this stop sign in the picture 4, where you have it in the Cree language as well as in English and in French. We also have, for example, crown, what we call crown corporations, such as British Columbia Ferries systems, and where they used to have names such as the Queen of Victoria and the Queen of Nanaimo, which were ferries that were named in the colonial representation, and now have made some attempts to address issues around colonization and represent the peoples that live up and down the coast. And lastly, language such as talking about Canada as being not as represented, not a representation by First Nations people and well, Indigenous people within Canada. And they will often go, certainly in terms of activism, and sometimes you will hear or be present at rallies or protests, and the word Turtle Island comes up a lot, which is the original word for this land of North America from the creation stories by Indigenous people. And so these are the kinds of things that I think for newcomers that come to live in Canada, they might come across and wonder, what is this language that is up on the sign, or what I'm hearing, or why is it in one map called Queen Charlotte Islands and another is called Haida Gwaii? It's trying to address some of these issues. And then I was thinking, so how do we bring that into the context of a language classroom? So we've been asked by Indigenous people, by their great effort to help with us as understanding the decolonization strategies and being aware of some of the word and languages that are used is really important. So even in terms of how it is that we do not say things like the Indigenous people of Canada, we say it is different than saying the Indigenous people in Canada, or do not use Canada's Indigenous people as a possessive, which suggests a hierarchical relationship, or Indigenous Canadians, as many Indigenous people do not identify with Canadian national identity. And that is clear by a lot of activists who are really trying to reclaim their own territory as well. So other things like such as to be aware of how verb tenses can mischaracterize histories, saying First Nations were or held traditional territories as opposed to how they hold traditional territories is significant, because they are not, we don't want, and in terms of decolonizational strategies and language, we don't want Indigenous people within this territory to be relegated to the history books, as it was so much for so many centuries. That has been the case. In the resource guide, I've also tried to include, as I said, some of the Indigenous literary terms such as capitalization, appropriate terms, and new vocabulary that may or may not be used very often. For example, the word unceded, which doesn't even come up in a spell check, but is used often in land acknowledgements, for example. And unceded really means that it is the land that was never signed over to the Crown or to the federal government or any government or of settler institutions within Canada. And so it's basically unceded means, in another way, it's stolen land. And having that, really understanding what we're saying here is really important, and how important that is to inform newcomers to Canada. In the resource, it's also giving opportunities for people to understand what a land acknowledgement is making, being, as I said in the very beginning of this presentation, how we understand that we are living and working on unceded territories. In the resource guide, there is a part about learning about the Indian Act in Canada, residential schools, child apprehension programs, and these all have to be done with a trauma-informed approach to the work, because they are have been such a devastating historical catastrophe for Indigenous people in Canada. But it's not to say that we shouldn't be talking about that and informing newcomer people about Canada's true history, the untold stories that are often not shared. And I can tell you from my own teaching experience, there was a lot being said about what Canada is as far as being an immigrant country, a land of, very benevolent, very kind people, but there's never sharing of the real or the other side of this sort of darker history of Canada. But then on another level, I also wanted to bring some of the hopeful practices that maybe students, especially if they are struggling with health issues or with self-care issues and those kinds of things. Some of the Indigenous spiritual practices that decolonization activists use, land reclamation, healing circles, and the medicine wheel. And these can be really helpful also for newcomers to learn and perhaps take some guidance from the way Indigenous communities work. And each of those are also included in the resource with what is required with the federal English language or French language programs, where the teachers are required to do portfolio-based language assessment. So there's tools and tasks in the resource for that purpose. I also wanted to talk in this about how Indigenous people want to be referred to, whereas we talk in general about Indigenous people or indigenization, decolonization, but Indigenous is like an international term. And within Canada, we also have over 140 First Nations. We also have the Inuit, which was in the past known as Eskimos, and we also have the Métis people. And in this short video clip, it talks about how it is that Indigenous people within Canada want to be addressed. They don't really want to be referred only as Indigenous or even just First Nations, but asking and finding out what nation they literally come from is really helpful and important to making sure that they are really present and part of the community that we all live and share. And so it's not just for me to find out, but it's also for newcomers, giving them the opportunity to learn and find out about the various over 140 First Nations within Canada itself. And then asking if you did have a conversation with a person from a First Nation, finding out which nation they literally come from. As I say in the guide, we talk a little bit about the residential school system and child apprehension programs such as the 60 Scoop and the Indian Act, which has haunted Canadian identity for decades. And if very recently we have come to learn about mass grave sites outside of residential schools, of mass graves of children that died at residential schools. And this has been a really heartbreaking part of our history, but it's also an opportunity for us to learn and to really acknowledge the history that Indigenous people have in Canada, and also helping I would say for the newcomer communities that come to Canada and are learning English or French to also acknowledge that these atrocities happened here, and that we are trying to make right and do better by it. And that is including everybody, and even, and that includes also newcomers to Canada. It is also important when I say that, though, that we explore some of these histories through readings and listening skill practices, but that we also do that with a trauma-informed approach, considering that many people have had forced migration experiences just the same as Indigenous people have in Canada. Talking about some of the decolonization efforts done across Canada by Indigenous communities, and in this case, there's a reading about the Mohawk people and their rise up against colonization and taking away of their territory in the 1990s Oka crisis. And this is helpful, I think, for newcomers to learn about, not only because it teaches about the true history of Canada, but it also understands about the historical traumas and the work that is being done to make a more just and equitable society for Indigenous people. There's also readings and really interesting listening skill practices around sovereignty and reclaiming of traditional lands, and self-determination, so that we don't all just fall into these kind of historical racist stereotypes of Indigenous people in Canada, but know that it's often a growing and flourishing communities within Canadian society as well. In the resource, and part of this has been, I wanted to talk about some of the spiritual practices, the well-being and self-care strategies that Indigenous people provide, and also want to share with the greater community, and how this has not only helped with their own healing, but it's also part of sharing that information to the greater community, including those who come from newcomer communities and refugee communities. There's a lot of similarities in their experiences in Canada with refugees that come to Canada to seek asylum. So it's an interesting kind of overlap of these two, different sort of groups that have had somewhat similar experiences of difficult histories within the context that they're coming from. I think for teachers that to be aware that in their classes for newcomers in Canada, there may be students that identify as Indigenous from elsewhere, such as Mayan people in Mexico and Central America, being aware that students in your class may also share similar experiences as Indigenous peoples in Canada is something to keep in mind when designing lesson plans, meaning that it's really important that you are creating a trauma-informed approach to the work. Because, as I say, there have been experiences of forced migration off of land in other countries, and then Canada accepts them to come here as refugees, but not acknowledging that there's also been forced migration within Canada, and there's been loss of territory and land and the disruption of culture, community, and language also within Canada. And it's important to, I think that it was also important for me to say this, it's in terms of teaching that we can easily slip into that idea of othering and they and them as though they're so different from us. And it's, as I say, it's really complicated because you don't want to assume anything about others or suggest that we are also all the same. And it's a dilemma when teaching, and I've tried to shift these form of address where appropriate throughout the resource. And just to say that I don't speak on behalf of Indigenous people. I am from an immigrant family myself and part of the settlement in Canada, but it's also and not to say that they as Indigenous people are all this way and we are all this way. It's something that I think for many people in Canada, we struggle with in terms of an identity and whether that is important or not, but it's something that is often brought up in classes with teachers. In the resource, we also provided an opportunity for communities to come together in a healing circle. And this was something that I think would be amazing and has been done since the resource has been written, that newcomer communities in a language class have come together to share a space where they can learn some of the key terms, discuss land claim, land reclamation and acknowledgements, and take a journey through the history of Indigenous people and how the Indigenous people experience Canada, and share that knowledge with new people that come to Canada. And it's been a really interesting and rewarding experience for people learning language and also thinking about how their efforts at decolonization are just as important as mine or anybody else in Canada. And then, so that's it. The resource guide is available through BC Teal, and you can look at it through the website there, and I've uploaded it here if you are interested to find out more about it.
Thank you very much, Diana. We appreciated hearing about the work that you're doing in Canada and Canada's work on decolonizing language in terms of names, signs, maps, and so forth. The resource guide that you shared looks like it has a wealth of useful practices for teachers who are teaching English to newcomers and immigrants, refugees, asylees in Canada. You've talked about the vocabulary and verb tenses that are being used, but what I liked was your notion of sharing untold stories and also sharing some of the spiritual and well-being practices. I think we've all learned in the times of the pandemic that social emotional well-being is so important for all of us. And thank you too for reminding us to avoid othering to the extent that we can. I will turn now to our final panelist today, and that is Blake Gentry. Blake is a member of the Universidad de Guanajuato's and UNESCO's Patrimonio Estético y Pueblos Indígenas, and an adjunct faculty with the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona. Blake conducts research on Indigenous autonomy and languages in migration, while advocating for Indigenous rights to identity and language along the US-Mexico border in that whole region. He directs the Indigenous Languages Office, which provides interpretation services for 17 Indigenous languages at a migrant shelter. His published research focuses on human rights violations in the US-Mexico border area, language law, policy, and language migration. His applied research has supported the class action lawsuits at the ACLU, and he's also successfully challenged conditions for immigrants in the Border Patrol facilities in Arizona. His advocacy has supported media reports and gained approval for a resolution for Indigenous migrant language rights by the Cherokee Nation. He recently published a manual of human anatomy in 17 Indigenous languages, but that's useful for doctors' offices and hospitals. He's provided training on interpretation protocols for unaccompanied Indigenous minors to the US American Bar Association's Immigrant Children's Section in Houston, Children in Need of Defense in San Francisco, Americans for Immigrant Justice in Dade County in Florida, and currently for the Vera Institute of Justice. His talk today is titled Indigenous Languages Migration Through the Arizona Border to the US Diaspora. Welcome, Blake. We need to unmute you, Blake.
Thank you. Struggling to find the microphone. The first thing I want to say is welcome to all the language speakers who are here today from Silver Spring, Maryland, New York, St. Louis, New Jersey, DC, the country of Fiji, Toluca, Mexico, Iran, Peru, Lima and Cajamarca, Croatia, Azerbaijan, Panama, Istanbul, Mississippi, the United States, Hillsborough and Portland, Oregon, and a few moments ago from India. I also would like to thank Elizabeth and Diana for the work that they do and the extent to which they have included Indigenous languages and have worked on the local level and provincial level to make the reality of Indigenous peoples known to the larger population. I want to thank TESOL for inviting me here today. It's an honor to be here. I live in Tucson, which in the O'odham language is Stuk Shon. 15 minutes from my house is the origin of this community, going back 2,500 years at the base of a mountain. It's traditional territory of the O'odham, who have a reservation just south of Tucson, and a mile further west, it's the second largest land reservation of Indigenous peoples in the United States. I will now try to share my screen.
Looks good.
Okay. So I'm going to address a couple of things. You're going to see language data, but I'm also going to look at the border immigration process and the language data specifically if you're in the United States, so that you may be able to locate those who speak languages that you find in your classroom, but in other places in the United States, and perhaps confer with other colleagues about the existences of these languages. I'm going to cover border migration, language exclusion at the US border, language diaspora, as I said, on the maps, and then a little bit on interpretation protocols. And I'm going to go fairly quickly. When I get to the parts of the maps, if you are in the United States, or even if you're not, if you're interested in a particular language, get ready to do a print screen, or later you might recuperate it from the recording. But you will see about 10 or 11 languages mapped throughout the United States. The principal routes for migration into the United States from the south, from Abya-Yala, which the Guna people in Panama called Abya-Yala, the Americas in English, is the Pacific route, which is black. They're coming from Mesoamerica through northern Mexico into Arizona to the California and New Mexico and Texas borders. But the other route is the Atlantic route, which is the red migration route. And both of these have their origin coming through Guatemala. The Pacific route, which is the black line. Most of those folks come from the highlands, which you can see on the map there. If you read Spanish, it says Tierras Altas or highlands, the Altiplano. The lowlands folks and the eastern and central languages, principally of Guatemala, follow the red route or the Atlantic route. At our border, what we see is a processing of thousands, tens of thousands of immigrants who have come through here from our data from 2014 to 2017. And they are picked up as they cross the border. This is a red line between the United States, Arizona, and Sonora, Mexico. And these tan-colored dots are those are the Mexican cities on the Mexico side, and the black ones are ports of entry on the US side. And all these folks are picked up by the Border Patrol and shipped to a processing center with the headquarters of the Border Patrol in Arizona, which is located on a military base. They are arrested and picked up by people who wear military uniforms and who are armed. The red lines there are for some folks who are picked up outside the near border area. They are often sent to Phoenix and also processed at a processing center there. What happens with Indigenous language speakers when they come to the border is that they are greeted by Border Patrolmen, as you see there, folks who are in uniform and are armed, and they are greeted in what is called command Spanish. Some of the Border Patrol speak Spanish as a native language, a second language. Others learn language in their classroom teaching, and it's called command Spanish, which literally means they know how to yell out commands to get physical control over those who are in their presence, because the Border Patrol is supposed to be an anti-terrorism unit. Where they find them are delineated there in the different types of areas that you see in those green boxes. The more important thing, though, is to understand that what they do when they encounter people, they process them and they ask them 4 questions. Those 4 questions are recorded and then can be used later. Those 4 questions are yes and no questions, and in Spanish, that's a sí or a no in terms of your answer. So if you don't understand the language, but you're bilingual enough to just say sí y no, then that's going to be recorded. And 2 years later, when you're in an asylum hearing, it can be used against you in immigration court, and it is every day. The process of exclusion is one of bewilderment for Indigenous language speakers. You see these colored different shapes here. Those all represent different agencies within the immigration system of the United States. Customs Border Patrol is blue. Border Patrol itself works out in the field is green. You get down to the bottom right, you see that light blue, that's USCIS, asylum interviewers. And then if you're in detention, you will see the yellow, because that's detention centers. That process, the arrest process, means 7 to 12 contacts of exclusion where your language is not recognized nor used. And if you're in detention, that's going to get up to 56 contacts per day. If you're a child, it's even more bewildering. There's going to be 7 contacts of exclusion in minimum when you are arrested and processed. You're picked up by the Border Patrol. You're given to ICE, which takes you to a facility run by the Department of Health and Human Services, which has contracted facilities which are overseen by the Administration of Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is out of Department of State. And then you're put into a so-called shelter, which is a detention center because you can't leave. And the services that are supposed to be provided all on the right there are all done in Spanish or in English. And unless someone makes a valiant effort to try to understand what the language is, they won't, and they won't identify it, and there will be no interpretation. And this is what happens before they're ever released. So their contacts are 5 exclusion contacts daily and 150 per month. They're usually in those detention centers from 1 to 2 months. One testimony that I had, which I published, was that a worker who spoke Quiche in there knew that there was a child who spoke Indigenous language, and because they didn't have any interpreters, he stayed in his own room for an entire week. The languages that we have encountered from 2014 through August 1st, 2019 include 28 languages from 7 different countries, including those from South America. You can see Quechua and Quichua from as far south as Ecuador and Peru. We'll get back to this. This is a data table. Let's just look at the one that's yellowed out there. We had a consistent finding of 20% of all the immigrants that we encountered who would identify actually for us the primary language as an Indigenous language. Many of them spoke 2 languages, but this is only about primary language. So we had a consistent finding from that first period. And then in the second period, we had high levels of immigrants coming from Central America. We found also it was about 20% And this is the data that we have used for the maps that you will see. What does this mean at the scale of the United States? In 2014, our estimate was this basically included about 30,000 adults and children. Of that number, about 6,000 to 7,000 were children. We found out this year through FOIA, which is a legal request to release information that wasn't released to the public, that in immigration court across the United States, the fourth largest language has been identified as unknown. The Mayan languages are always in the top listing out of Immigration Court's report, Executive Office Immigration Review Annual Statistical Report, and they're in the top 25. Here is a breakdown of languages that come from Guatemala, which is most of those we see. They are indigenous Mayan languages, which predate the concept of the Americas or Latin America. They are languages that have a proto-language of 4,000 years. Those in the left side of that map are from Western Guatemala, which we see the most. This is a frequency priority list of those who've come through our shelter. And these all have then migrated into the United States. The one on the far left is Mixtec from Mexico, one that has some 52 different variants or dialects, and we have just identified one there. This kind of mapping is what you can use to identify these languages if you're a classroom teacher or you are doing the registration of these children that come into your school. Here is a map of part of the origins of these folks, a bubble map. You can see this is Central America and Southern Mexico, and you can see how these languages are concentrated. We don't show South America here, but we have Quechua speakers coming from Ecuador as well. Here's a distribution in the United States. The darker the color, the more concentration of the various languages and their speakers who have arrived in these states, and we will break this down. Excuse me. Here again is the same map, but however, here's the concentration demographically or social linguistically. And now I'm going to go through individual maps. I'm just going to point out some patterns. So if you have speakers of indigenous languages in your classrooms and you don't know where they come from, or rather you don't know where else they are spoken in the United States, this is your opportunity to be able to identify that. Mam is the most frequent language that we have. You can see the pattern there, favors Florida and the Southeast area. And so recognize a little bit that pattern. Here we have Quiche. Quiche is the largest Mayan language in Guatemala. And here we see a pattern that's just very dispersed. Here's the Quechua. It's similar to Quiche, but also some high concentrations in particular areas. Here we have Canjobal, which follows pretty much the Canjobal pattern, but a little bit different. And those are two languages from different regions of Guatemala, Canjobal from Western Highlands and Quechua from the lowlands, Petén area, Alto Verapaz. Choc is from Western Guatemala. Now you're going to see a repetition of a pattern, except the Ixil. Ixil is next to Quiche in Guatemala, and they also follow there's pretty much following the Quiche diaspora. Jacateco is a Western Guatemalan language. Here we see the same pattern as some of the others. Jacalteco Popti, two names for the same language. Achi is Eastern Guatemala, and here we see their distribution. Cachiquel is Central Guatemala. It's similar to the Quiche, and historically they live next to Quiche communities. Quechua, from, as I mentioned, which is a language within the Quechua language family from South America. And finally, Mixtec, showing up here in Southern Mexico. I'm sorry, in Southern California. It's a language from Mexico, Mixtec, so that's that. We did a statistical analysis of the appearance of these languages compared to random arrivals in the different states of the United States. And I'm just going to show you the concentration of the 5 areas where we have the largest clusters. I don't have time to go through all the languages. But if you know the languages in your area, you can look here quickly through the list and see if you see any of them or grab the slide later. The higher the number from 1 to 10 is the higher the concentration of that particular language in that region. So California, the Phoenix, California corridor, Phoenix, Arizona, California corridor, including Southern California around LA and San Francisco, the Bay Area, is a large concentration, but not the largest. We have urban Texas, Dallas, and Houston. Quiche has a long presence in Houston. Florida has twice as many indigenous language speakers arriving than any other state, including California, and it is the key and most important state for the distribution of languages from indigenous languages coming through the southern border. and you'll see why in a moment. There's some numbers there, others are higher, but you see that there's a big diversity of the languages that are there from different parts of Guatemala and other parts of Mesoamerica. Here we have a very interesting pattern of language distribution, and these languages all came through the corridor, mostly passing through Florida, some of them from through Georgia and Alabama to get to this place. As a member of the Cherokee Nation, I recognize the concentrations as places that are being filled in by indigenous peoples who are in migration, where there had been indigenous nations before their forced removal in the 1840s of the 5 tribes, including Cherokee Nation, to Indian Territory, where my grandfather was born in 1907, 3 months before the Cherokee Nation was eliminated by the federal government and turned indigenous and Indian Territory into the state of Oklahoma. Here we have the last concentration, call this the Megalopolis Corridor. It starts in the DC tri-state area, concentrations in Philly, New York, New Jersey, and Boston. And there are some interesting patterns here, which we don't have time to go over sociolinguistically, especially with Quiche and Cachiquel, and their approximation and the pattern of resettlement of languages next to languages which they originated with in their place of origin. Now I'm going to go into a little bit of stigma. Some of the other speakers spoke about this, and frankly, the biggest issue that we have where I work is a shelter, and people are there for short periods, usually 48 hours. Some who have medical conditions stay for longer until those are resolved. But the biggest issue we have is not identifying indigenous languages. It's trying to reduce the stigma so that indigenous peoples feel that they can actually identify their language and won't put them under a threat. There's 2 definitions here. You see the one on the top from Oxford, and it identifies stigma pertaining to a single person or individually. And then here we have a quote from Sergio Romero, a great social linguist who studies Mayan languages. And he mentions the context in which this stigma occurs, and he identifies this as a more collective experience. Those boxes, those dioramas you see up there, 5 of those 7 children were indigenous language speakers who died at the US-Mexico border in the custody of the United States Border Patrol, who never spoke their language to them or their parents. And they died, except for one of them, of completely curable health conditions that were not revealed because the languages were not spoken. When we speak about indigenous languages, it's important to understand this is not a model of multiculturalism that was now invented, and therefore indigenous peoples exist. Indigenous peoples have established their rights after a lot of struggle internationally. You'll see on the top left this mention of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Every country in the world has now agreed to this or signed on to this international convention coming out of the UN after 21 years of struggle. The second one is the International Labour Organization, which is actually a stronger convention, though major countries have not signed on to that, including the United States. ILO Convention 169 out of the ILO, which precedes the UN. And then finally, the Organization of American States and their American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also took 30 years to establish. So when we talk about indigenous rights, we're not talking about favoring one culture over another. We're talking about the right to exist according to international norms, which follow the International Declaration of Human Rights, but in the indigenous context. In the United States, we have a thin but important piece of law, which should be helping but is not helping indigenous language speakers. It's called Executive Order 13166, signed by William Clinton, which states the following. You can read it. It pertains to limited English proficient folks. That's your work in TESOL. And if they are at a federal agency, that federal agency is supposed to make an effort to identify the most frequent languages of speakers who come who cannot access services because they don't speak English. They're supposed to then go beyond the individual identification of those people and do an assessment of their language populations and then provide services of interpretation so that their services can be accessed by those same people. Also, and most importantly, any organization in the United States that receives a government federal grant also has to follow this, and none of the organizations that I know that I work with on a daily basis are doing anything close to that. This is recently published protocols for interpretation. It really applies to shelters, but you can change some of the language in here and figure out how to use this in your own place. What I want to say is that in bringing in languages and welcoming people, it starts before you open your language from your particular mouth. In the preparation, some of what my colleagues were mentioning, Elizabeth and Diana, paves the way for this. The visuals that Diana showed also are something that you can have, not just in your classroom, but if you have some of those in the school where students come in and they register with, or their parents bring them in to register, if you have that process in your area where there's Indigenous languages, this is important to have the maps out and ready so that you can use them to identify. And so this isn't a rarefied thing. And the first thing you don't want to do is say, well, does anybody here speak a language other than Spanish or other than English or whatever the national language is? Try to take the positive approach of welcoming all languages from the very beginning. That's why we have the step number 2. Step number 3 is also recognize that when families come in, the elders are those folks who should be given some respect. And if they're not respected, then it's going to be a very quick cue to those families that their children probably are not going to be recognized as Indigenous nor have their languages recognized, and they will shut down and they will not identify their language for you. The 4th one you can modify to say that it's important to be able to identify the language because of the needs to exchange information with the family and the school and their children throughout the school year. We follow in these steps. I did well, number 5, also an alternative. Instead of saying primary language, most children won't understand what you mean. You can ask them, what is the language what is the language that's spoken the most in your home? And you may find some hesitancy, especially for those languages I've identified. They're used to telling people they speak Spanish because they don't want them to think that they're not educated, and they don't want them to think that they can't understand some things. But that doesn't mean that's the primary language that's spoken at home. It also doesn't mean that that's the language that they're strongest in. So this is part of the practical process of how do you deal with the stigma so that you're not just glossing over the fact that they speak an Indigenous language and try to get down to what it is. Again, in number 6, you can use maps. You will have some links to those in the very last slide so that you can access those maps, one for Mesoamerica, one for Mexico, and one for South America, especially the Quechua language family. Lastly, you can use an interpreter. If you're in a situation like we are, you have to be careful. Don't use children as interpreters unless you're absolutely in an extreme emergency and somebody's life is at risk. I will move quickly into a few other things that can be used in terms of trying to use interpretation protocols. Obviously, your teachers, you know how to do this. In my day and age, we often only had this kind of thing in a social studies class or a geography class or whatever. But welcoming students coming in the very beginning of the first part of the semester, inviting all students in and identifying everybody's culture and everybody's language and showing it visibly in the classroom through maps, through some cultural identification. Some of the slides that Diana showed would be great. Just apply it to your area and mention that you like to speak languages and say the languages that you speak or even ones that you might have interested in. I put some languages up here: Polish, Hausa, Farsi, Spanish, Kurdish, et cetera, to let people know that languages are what happens around the world, not just the one language that you're speaking in the classroom. I'm going to do something real quick, a little bit as a practicum. People who see languages or hear them for the first time or not familiar with them don't know how to identify them. So I'm going to give you a little exercises how you can deal with principally Mayan languages. And I'm going to flip back very quickly to a slide, but get a pencil and a piece of paper if you can, and we'll go through this. And you can use this or you could teach this to people in your school as a way to do this. So here we have these languages. Some of them have similar syllables, which may trip you up. Number 2, Acateca, number 3, Ahuacateca, etc. So what I have done with people in my shelter, all who don't speak any of these languages, and some of them only speak English, is the following. When I train them, I tell them to do the following. When you hear a language, don't be looking at the list of languages. What you want to do is listen for the first syllable. Why? Because the first syllable almost never repeats. So if you listen to the first syllable and you're very clear about that, then you'll probably be able to pick out the language. So I want you all to do is close your eyes, everybody, no cheating. And I want you to listen, and I'm going to say the name of a language the way that a language speaker would say it a couple of times. You can always ask people to slow down, but they usually don't. And then see if you can pick it out. So close your eyes, here we go. Tsutukhil, tsutukhil, tsutukhil. Now you can open your eyes. And if you heard tsut, you can look and see what you phonetically think represents that in this list of languages. Hopefully you are around the languages of number 25 or 26. Those two are often confused. 26 is the correct answer. 25 is tzotzil, which is from Chiapas, Mexico, and tzutukhil is from Guatemala around the Lake Atitlan area. I could go over more, there's not enough time. This works for this whole list of languages, except for these two, 17 and 18, because that first syllable or first and second syllable are the same, pokomam, pokomchi. So in that case, you're going to have to listen to the last syllables, but it works for all of the rest of these. There's confusions of others, often kekchi and kiche, because people are not used to those sounds, especially for those who are English speakers. I'm going to flip back to where we were and get towards the other protocols here. The other things I do in a longer training would be how to reduce language stigma with particular protocols beyond what we just did, how to assure confidentiality in the interpreters that you choose in terms of matching interpreters with children. One of our previous speakers spoke about trauma. All of the people that we see coming through our shelter are traumatized. They've either been traumatized in their home country, which is why they fled, or they were traumatized on the journey, or they were traumatized at the border, and now they're going to go to someplace in the interior. So I spent a whole hour on how to work with traumatized children who are in detention, who have come out of detention for the legal organizations that are representing them. The other protocol is for identification of place and family, so that you can identify language, and then looking at particular language which have language variants or dialects which do need to be taken into consideration when identifying interpreters, or you will have an interpreter from the same language which doesn't work for your speaker. That's pretty much my presentation. These are some of the trainings that I have provided to legal organizations, but I would be happy to work with schools. I am also a co-founder and a member of the National Council of Diaspora of Indigenous Peoples in the United States, which is made up of 4 organizations and individuals across the United States of Indigenous immigrants. And those include International Mayan League, Comunidad Indígena Pichín Nishim, Pueblos Originarios out of New York, Indigenous Alliance Without Borders here in Tucson, and the Universidad de Guanajuato project was mentioned before. So I'm going to leave you with this slide, and here you will have links to maps which you can use and links to languages. The most difficult one to use is the Inali one because it was done by a government agency. It's a catalog. You have to go to the language family and drill down to try to find the language. So I would suggest using the map first. I would always suggest using a map first, a political map, to find the department or the state. In the Americas, all the countries south of the US have departamentos, not estados, except for Mexico and Brazil. So you need to ask for their departamento, their municipio, and their pueblo or canton. And this is how you start to identify the area that they come from. This also quickly opens up the interest that you display and demonstrate about cultures to these people. And then lastly, there's some other references here which you might find useful. So I want to thank everybody. In my language, we say wado, wado ani tesol, for your assistance, your participation and your attendance today, and for including Indigenous peoples in your work throughout the world.
Wado Blake, thank you very much. This was really eye-opening with incredible information, data, maps. The whole notion of language exclusion at the border, I don't think gets enough coverage, certainly in US media. And the push for Indigenous rights ties back to our other panelists as well. So can I just say thank you for living TESOL's first principle. We have 6 principles of instruction, but the first one is know your learners. And what you've done is giving us some tools and ideas about how we can know our learners who are coming into the classroom with us. So the webinar, as everybody knows, has been recorded, and it will be on TESOL's YouTube channel within about 5 days. You'll be able to see the slides there. But I will also ask the panelists if you have a direct contact or a link that you'd like to put in the chat. That may help some of our participants here find additional information or find ways to contact you. As we said at the beginning, we're happy to have questions come in the chat from you for our 3 panelists. I pulled a few of those out. I will ask one to start to each of our panelists, and then we can move on. Or if you would like at that point to unmute and ask a question directly, that would be fine too. So let me begin with Elizabeth. First, I'll just give you a piece of praise that came from Ruthie saying, this sounds great and I love the strategies. Yaneth said that it happens in most countries that they want to introduce English in their curriculum, particularly for economics. They perceive English as a way to improve the learner's ability to get a job. So the question is, what do you think about suggestions to teach English along with cultural information as you've provided? Do you think this helps with that tension of getting a job? And do you have resources that are available to do so?
Thanks. Thank you for the question. But first of all, I would like to thank TESOL because they are now exploring these new concepts. I remember that they used to basically, or it was an intention in the past to focus on the teaching of English only in the whole world, but today they are giving a space to these new approaches to exploring, to problematizing the English language in the world. And now I would like to thank this space to discuss such a thorny topic, right? But now I would like to thank the question. And here is an issue going on with the language. We are now focusing in South America or in Chile to exploring English not only as this tool of social development and economic development, because we have already realized that this is not the clue or the way to solve the problem, because English in Chile has become a tool of social segregation. Only people that come from good economic backgrounds that can pay for private education have access to learning good level of English, and still the rest of the community has to apply to get a better job or to get into the university. So some way or another, the society or the citizens have to try to overcome this new way of filtering access to economic development, individual development. But I would also mention the work of some other researchers that have been working on this field. We have Ricento, Bouthriot, but Gliffer, sorry if I don't have a good pronunciation. There is another also that I'm forgetting, but they say that in the countries where you have more problems, so economic problems, you need to focus on learning the first language first instead of focusing on a foreign language. But some other researchers say that even if you have a level of English and another skill, it is the accent, the strong accent when you speak English that still prevents you to get a good job. So it's having English or learning English is not the solution to solve economic problems or to raise the professional career. It all depends on the context in which the learners or the speakers of a native and a foreign language live and work, that they can improve their skills or they can improve their economic situation, having command of a first, second, and third language and a native language. I am not sure if I am answering this question. I hope so.
I think you have, Elizabeth. Certainly you've talked a little bit about the tension between a government approach for pushing for English, thinking it's going to solve all of the economic troubles. But instead, as you said, people need to develop their own first language skills, develop knowledge in their first language, and use that as a springboard for success. Thank you. Diana, there was a question for you.
Thanks.
You mentioned the residential schools, obviously, a little bit in your presentation. The question here is, how should EFL teachers approach the issue, discussing these recent discoveries of the children in the burial plots? How should they, or how have they, or is there any advice that you'd offer? Diane, I don't know if you're.
I'm sorry, I can't access the video, so you can just listen. Just to say that I think it's really going to be up to the teacher to understand their students. It's not something that I would ever suggest as for a lower level language learner, only because the issues and the concerns of residential schools in Canada are better for sort of unpacking it and really understanding it in English would be needed to be done in a higher level. And I had some pushback from somebody from, interesting, from the Catholic School Board in Canada, saying that they didn't think it should be taught in an English language classroom because they thought if it felt that it wasn't given enough respect when you're trying to learn English and you're talking about something that's so deeply painful for people, and for it to be used as a language acquisition exercise. And I understand that, but I also think that the language classroom is one of the few places that newcomers often get an opportunity to learn interesting and realistic histories. We're often asked to teach about the parliamentary systems in Canada in higher level language classes. We get a ton of paraphernalia from the federal government sending us little flags and this kind of stuff for Canada Day. So I don't see why it is that we also can't talk and discuss and learn about this untold history. Because I think it also helps to not fall into those deep-seated pitfalls of settler cultures, so which are racist in fact. So I think that it needs to be handled very, very strategically and carefully with a trauma-informed approach, understanding that people think of Canada as only this extremely lovely, kind people that is very. And it is very multicultural, and it is a very lovely and kind place for many people, but it's not true for all. And I think that with respect to understanding that history is just a really important piece for newcomers to learn so that they can move forward. So just with a lot of gentle easing into the topic, and maybe deciding whether or not, depending on the students and their experiences of trauma, whether it would be a good thing to unpack in a class or not.
Thank you, Diana. I think the other thing that we might think about is that often the classroom where you're learning English is a safe space as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And that really comes with making sure that you have done the trauma-informed approach in your teaching practice long before you start to talk about residential schools or the child apprehension programs that have existed. Yeah.
Blake, I'm going to combine two questions here. They're somewhat related. One is, do all Indigenous languages have written forms? And related to that is, how do you find people to help you with interpreting? Do they do any translation, and do you provide training to them? So, for example, on key technical terms.
The answer to the first question is no, not all Indigenous languages have a written form, but all of the Indigenous languages that have come through our shelter do have written languages. In the Mayan world, since most of the languages are Mayan, though I studied Quechua before even working with Mayan people, and Quechua has been written for a long time, at least 3 generations of 4. The reality is that Mayan languages originally were written, and then priests of the Catholic Church burned in the Yucatan alone over 200 documents as a part of the ongoing Inquisition that was brought into the Americas. Deliberately, they burned documents that were written by Mayan priests or Mayan ceremonial people because they contained all the vocabulary and the knowledge that was in written Mayan. Now, written Mayan continues to have a record. They're called stela, where you have hieroglyphs that are, or glyphs that are on stones at large former Mayan city-states. Tikal in Guatemala is one of them. I've been to Tikal many times. So it's a complicated answer, but from the 20s on, 1920s on, 30s, 40s, 50s, began a whole cycle of foreigners, mostly missionaries, coming into these areas, into the Americas, and attempting to start writing down languages. And they were able to eventually transfer some of their skills to native speakers and to linguists from those countries, who then founded their own organizations. That's a very short, brief way of talking about the Academia de las Lenguas Mayas in Guatemala, which was pushed for by all the Mayan people. And then with the revolutionary forces negotiating at the end of a 36-year war, they were able to secure that particular academy became a para-state organization. It's now supported by the government. Every language of the Mayan 22 that are in Guatemala have a language facility, a physical place, a lodge, and they have a president who is in charge of the priorities for developing what they want to in their languages. Mexico is a different entity in terms of how it deals with this. There is, though, an Indigenous Language Institute, which is called INALI, the acronym, and so on and so forth. In the United States, we don't have anything equivalent to that. Different universities concentrate in various languages, notably Tulane University, University of Texas at Austin, UCLA, Columbia, and so on and so forth. BC and Vancouver is well known. So I hope that answers that one. The second part of that is.
Blake, I'm sorry, but I've just gotten the word that we're out of time. So we'll have to conclude here.
Okay.
I would like to ask everybody to use their reaction buttons and give a big thank you to our panelists for this fascinating discussion of Indigenous languages, ways that we can support them, support the people, and our teachers as well. So for me, to Diana, to Elizabeth, and to Blake, thank you very, very much. And just as a final reminder, we will have TESOL Week starting next week from November 1st to 5th, where we're celebrating TESOL. We'll have a number of different activities every day, both through social media and through webinars. We hope to see you at some of them. And we will have our TESOL convention in Pittsburgh in March 2022. I think it's the 23rd through the 22nd through the 25th. We will have both a face-to-face and virtual convention, so it's a true hybrid. And registration will be opening November 1st for that. Juliet will put a link to learn more in the chat. And then finally, for those of you who are with us who are also TESOL members, our election season begins on Friday. So please remember to vote for your next president-elect, your board of directors, and your members of the nominating committee. Elections will close, the voting period will close on November 19th. Thank you, everybody, for your participation here today. Thank you for supporting TESOL. And let me say again, Elizabeth, Diana, and Blake, thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
Thank you for having us.
Goodbye, everyone.
Well done to all of you.